The morning of September 15th, 1940, above the Thames estuary, Flight Lieutenant Geoffrey Wellham eases his Spitfire into a climbing turn, the Merlin engines roar, filling his leather helmet. At 28,000 feet, the air is thin enough that each breath requires conscious effort. Below him, the silver ribbon of the Thames cuts through the patchwork of Kent and Surrey. Above him, nothing but empty sky, or so it appears. Then the radio crackles. Bandits. High. 30 plus. Wellham scans upward and sees them. A formation of Messerschmitt Bf-109s, tiny as gnats against the pale blue, but unmistakably there. They have the altitude. They have the sun. By every tactical doctrine drilled into him at flight school, they have the advantage. He reaches for the throttle and pushes it forward, past the gate marked with red paint and a small bent wire, the emergency boost override. The instructions are explicit. Use only in combat, use sparingly, expect engine, stress, possible failure, or fire. The Merlin responds not with a cough or a shudder, but with a surge. The airspeed indicator climbs. The altimeter needle sweeps upward with an eagerness that seems physically impossible. Wellham feels himself pressed deeper into his seat. And then something extraordinary happens. Something that should not be possible according to the intelligence briefings, according to the German technical superiority everyone whispers about in the mess halls. He begins to outclimb the Messerschmitts. 3,000 feet below, a Luftwaffe pilot, Lieutenant Hans Eberling of Jagdgeschwader 2-6, does exactly what he has been trained to do. He pushes his own throttle forward, engaging the emergency boost on his Daimler-Benz DB601 engine. This engine has been cleared for this maneuver. It was designed for this. Eberling has done this dozens of times over France, over the Channel, over the smoking wreckage of British airfields. But today, his engine does not respond as it should. The climb rate is adequate but not exceptional. And ahead of him, impossibly, the British Spitfire continues to rise, pulling away with a speed that contradicts everything he knows about enemy capabilities. For the first time since the beginning of this war, Eberling experiences something close to doubt. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Eberling does not know, what none of the Luftwaffe intelligence officers have correctly assessed, is that the Spitfire is not running on the fuel specified in the pre-war technical manuals captured from British sources. It is running on something else entirely, something that should not exist according to international agreements, patent laws, and the comfortable assumptions of the global petroleum industry. It is running on one man's quiet rebellion against the rules of war and commerce. To understand how this happened, we must go backward 4 years, to a small laboratory in Sunbury-on-Thames, a suburb southwest of London where the river winds through green Surrey countryside. The year is 1936. The building belongs to the Asiatic Petroleum Company, a subsidiary of Royal Dutch Shell. Inside, beneath fluorescent lights that hum faintly in the afternoon quiet, a 38-year-old chemist named Francis Rodwell Banks stares at a piece of paper. The paper is a translated intelligence summary from Spain, where the German Condor Legion is testing new aircraft in support of Franco's nationalists. The report describes a fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf-109. It mentions climb rates, ceiling heights, and a single technical detail that most readers would skip over, the fuel specification. B4 blend, 96 octane. Banks set the paper down. He removes his spectacles and cleans them with a handkerchief, a habitual gesture when he is thinking. Then he walks to a filing cabinet and retrieves another document. The current specification for Royal Air Force aviation fuel, 87 octane, 9 points of difference. To anyone outside the specialized world of engine chemistry, this might seem trivial, a minor variation in a technical standard, but Banks knows what those 9 points mean in practical terms. Octane rating measures a fuel's resistance to premature detonation under compression. Higher octane fuel allows an engine to operate at higher manifold pressure, more air and fuel forced into the cylinders, which translates directly into more power. More power means faster acceleration, higher top speed, better climb rate, and crucially, superior performance at altitude, where the air is thin and every advantage compounds. 9 octane points is not a minor difference. It is the difference between predator and prey. Banks does a series of calculations in a notebook. He knows the specifications of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that powers the Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane. He knows its displacement, its supercharger ratios, its thermal limits. He calculates what would happen if the Merlin could be run at higher boost pressures, if the fuel could tolerate it. The numbers are striking. An increase of 6 pounds per square inch of manifold pressure from +6 to +12 could yield an additional 400 horsepower at altitude. Climb rate could improve by perhaps 800 feet per minute. The combat ceiling could rise by 4,000 or 5,000 feet. In a dogfight, where victory often belongs to whoever can gain the altitude advantage first, this is not merely significant, it is decisive. But there is a problem, and Banks knows it intimately because it is his job to know it. The problem is not technical. The chemistry of high-octane fuel is well understood. The problem is legal, political, and economic. In the 1930s, the global aviation fuel industry operated as a cartel. Not openly, not with signed agreements displayed in boardrooms, but through a web of patent-sharing arrangements, licensing deals, and informal understandings between the major petroleum companies, Shell, Standard Oil, Anglo-Persian, and others. They have divided the world's markets and, more importantly, they have divided the formulas. The production of high-octane aviation fuel requires specific chemical additives, most notably tetraethyl lead, which prevents engine knock by raising the fuel's octane rating. The patents for tetraethyl lead production and blending are controlled by a small number of companies, primarily in the United States and Britain. These companies have agreed, tacitly or explicitly, on standard fuel grades for different markets. For commercial aviation, 87 octane is deemed sufficient and economical. For military aviation in Europe, the same standard applies, with exceptions. The exceptions are significant. Germany, operating under different agreements and with its own chemical industry developing alternative additives, has pushed its fuel standards higher. The Luftwaffe specifies 96 octane. Some experimental fuels go higher still. Britain, meanwhile, remains at 87 octane not because the technology is unavailable, but because the infrastructure is not in place and the cost is prohibitive. High-octane fuel requires more expensive refining processes, more additives, more quality control. The margins are thinner, and in peacetime, when budgets are constrained and the Air Ministry is more concerned with the number of aircraft than the quality of their fuel, there is little incentive to invest in retooling refineries for a more expensive product. Banks understands all of this. He also understands that these economic and legal considerations, sensible in peacetime, will become catastrophically irrelevant in war. He begins to experiment in his laboratory, using small batches of base fuel and carefully measured amounts of palmally, tetraethyl lead and other additives. He is not conducting official research. He has not been asked to do this by his superiors at Shell. He is working, in effect, on his own initiative driven by a conviction that is equal parts patriotism and professional pride. By early 1937, Banks had synthesized several small batches of experimental fuel. He calls it RD/X fuel, with RD standing for Research Department. It tests at 100 octane. Now he faces a choice. He can report his results through proper channels, submit them to Shell's management, wait for approval, navigate the patent issues, and request formal trials with the Air Ministry. This process could take months or years, or he can take a more direct approach. Banks chooses the latter. He sends samples of his fuel, along with a brief technical note, directly to test pilots at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough and to the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment at Martlesham Heath. His note is simple. Try this. Push the throttle past the emergency gate. Report what happens. This is not how things are supposed to be done. It violates protocol. It circumvents his own company's chain of command. And it places test pilots in a position of using an unapproved fuel that could, theoretically, damage their engines or cause in-flight failures. But Banks calculates that the risk is minimal and the potential payoff is enormous. He is betting that the data will speak for itself. Flight Lieutenant Ronald Gustav Kellett receives his sample of RD/X fuel in April of 1937. Kellett is a test pilot assigned to evaluate the Hawker Hurricane, a new monoplane fighter that is beginning to replace the RAF's aging biplanes. He has been briefed on the Hurricane's performance envelope, including the strict prohibition against exceeding emergency boost settings except in the most dire operational circumstances. Kellett is also, by temperament, the kind of pilot who views rules as suggestions subject to experimental validation. On a clear morning, he takes the Hurricane up to 15,000 feet, levels off, and then advances the throttle past the emergency gate. The instructions posted in the cockpit warn him not to do this. The engine manufacturer's specifications warn him not to do this. Common sense, arguably, warns him not to do this. The engine responds with a deeper, more aggressive note. The airspeed indicator surges. The climb rate, already impressive by the standards of the time, increases dramatically. Kellett later estimated the improvement at approximately 2,000 feet per minute. When he lands, he expects to be reprimanded or possibly dismissed. Instead, the engineering officer asks him a single question: "How much of that fuel do you have?" The answer is, "Not much." Banks's laboratory samples are measured in gallons, not thousands of gallons, but the test results are documented, and they are compelling. Within weeks, the data reaches the Air Ministry, where it lands on the desk of officials who are beginning to wake up to the reality of German rearmament. The Air Ministry is interested, very interesting. But interest does not immediately translate into action. There are procedures, there are budgets, there are committees that must be consulted, and there is the uncomfortable fact that producing 100 octane fuel at scale will require significant investment in refinery modifications, reliable sources of additives, and solutions to the patent issues that Banks has cheerfully ignored. Banks, meanwhile, continues his work. He refines his formula. He produces more samples. He cultivates relationships with pilots and engineers who share his sense of urgency. And he begins to write memos carefully worded, technically precise, relentlessly logical memos arguing that the cost of high-octane fuel is trivial compared to the cost of losing fighters and pilots in combat. One of his calculations becomes particularly influential. He estimates that RD/X fuel costs approximately 3 times as much per gallon as standard 87 octane fuel. He then notes that a Spitfire costs £12,604 to manufacture. If high-octane fuel allows even one Spitfire to survive an engagement, it would otherwise lose. The fuel pays for itself many times over. If it saves the pilot's life, and with it, years of training and irreplaceable combat experience, the economic argument becomes overwhelming. But economics is not the only obstacle. The real barrier, Banks begins to understand, is institutional inertia and the deeply entrenched interests of the petroleum industry. In the autumn of 1938, Banks presented his findings to a meeting of Shell executives in London. He brings charts, performance data, testimonials from test pilots, and a sober analysis of the German threat. He explains that the Luftwaffe's fighters are already using higher octane fuel and that this gives them a measurable combat advantage. He argues that Britain must match or exceed this capability immediately. The response from the boardroom is polite, cautious, and ultimately negative. The official reasons are technically sound. Producing 100-octane fuel at scale requires modifications to refinery equipment. The supply chain for tetraethyl lead is constrained. International patent agreements would need to be renegotiated or, more bluntly, violated. The legal risks are significant. The financial risks are significant. And there is the simple fact that the Air Ministry has not yet issued a formal requirement for high-octane fuel. The unofficial reason, which Banks understands, but which is never stated explicitly, is that the petroleum industry operates on thin margins and long-term contracts. High-octane fuel disrupts this equilibrium. It requires capital investment with uncertain returns. It introduces complexity into a system that prizes stability and predictability. Banks is told, in the politest possible terms, to drop the project and return to his assigned work. He nods. He thanks the executives for their time. He gathers his papers and leaves the boardroom, and then he goes directly back to his laboratory and continues working. This is an act of professional insubordination that could cost him his career. But Banks has reached a conclusion that overrides all other considerations. War is coming. Britain's fighters will be outmatched, and he has the knowledge to change the outcome. The question of whether he has the authority to do so seems, to him, irrelevant. The Munich Agreement was signed on September 30th, 1938. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returns to London, waving a piece of paper and proclaiming, "Peace for our time." The newsreels show cheering crowds. The newspapers print optimistic headlines. Banks do not share the optimism. He has been corresponding with engineers in France, with technical attachés who have access to intelligence on German military capabilities. He has seen the specifications for the Messerschmitt Bf-109 model, the latest variant entering service with the Luftwaffe. The Bf-109 is powered by the Daimler-Benz DB601A engine, a liquid-cooled inverted V12 with direct fuel injection. It is designed to run on 96-octane fuel at a minimum. Its combat ceiling is listed at 36,000 feet. Its climb rate is exceptional. British fighters, the Spitfire Mark I and the Hurricane Mark I, running on 87-octane fuel, have a combat ceiling of approximately 31,000 feet, 5,000 feet of altitude. 5,000 feet where German fighters can operate with impunity, choosing when and how to engage, diving out of the sun with speed and altitude advantages that are nearly impossible to overcome. Banks does the math again, this time not for economic analysis but for body count. If the Luftwaffe RAF's fighters cannot reach the altitude where German bombers operate, they cannot defend Britain. If they cannot match the climb rate of German fighters, they will be shot down before they can engage. The arithmetic is simple and brutal. he takes his case beyond Shell, directly to the Air Ministry. He contacts Wing Commander Frank Whittle, who is developing the jet engine and who understands the importance of pushing beyond conventional limits. He speaks with anyone who will listen, making the same argument over and over. War is imminent, the RAF's fuel is inadequate, the solution exists, and every day of delay increases the cost in lives. In March of 1939, 6 months before the invasion of Poland, the Air Ministry made a decision that was both extraordinary and overdue. They invoke emergency powers, powers that technically should not be used except in wartime, and issue a directive to British refineries. Begin production of 100-octane aviation fuel immediately. The directive does not mention patent violations. It does not address the legal complications or the diplomatic ramifications. It simply states that the fuel is required for national security and must be produced. This decision is made possible, in part, by Banks's persistent advocacy, but it is also driven by a growing recognition within the government that Chamberlain's peace is temporary at best and illusory at worst. Intelligence reports from the continent are increasingly alarming. The German military buildup is accelerating, and the RAF, despite its modern aircraft, is under-equipped in a way that is not immediately visible but is potentially catastrophic. The refineries respond with remarkable speed. Within weeks, modification work begins. Engineers redesign blending systems. Supply chains for tetraethyl lead are secured. Shell, despite its earlier reluctance, commits resources. So do other companies. The government provides funding. The project becomes a national priority, though it receives little publicity. But there is still a critical shortage. Britain does not produce tetraethyl lead in sufficient quantities. The chemical is complex to manufacture safely, requiring specialized equipment and expertise. The primary global supplier is the Ethyl Corporation in the United States, and the United States, in the spring of 1939, is resolutely neutral. A British purchasing commission arrives in Washington in the summer of 1939 with an unusual request. They need tetraethyl lead, a great deal of it. 15 million gallons worth of additive, which translates to enough treated fuel to supply the RAF for months of intensive operations. They cannot officially explain why they need it, because Britain is not yet at war and cannot be seen preparing for one in ways that would violate American neutrality laws. But the subtext is clear to anyone paying attention. Britain expects war and is preparing its air force for sustained combat operations. The American response surprises the British delegation. After consultations that are deliberately opaque and involve channels that are deliberately informal, the answer comes back, yes, the tetraethyl lead will be provided. Not through official government channels, which would be politically impossible, but through corporate sales that are technically private transactions and therefore not subject to the same scrutiny. The legal fictions are maintained, the paperwork is carefully structured, and the chemical flows across the Atlantic. By August of 1939, Britain had stockpiled enough tetraethyl lead to produce 1.4 million gallons of 100-octane fuel. By September 3rd, the day Britain declares war on Germany following the invasion of Poland, that number has more than tripled. And Rod Banks's formula, which began as an unauthorized experiment in a small laboratory, became the standard fuel for every RAF fighter squadron. The implications of this are not immediately apparent to anyone outside a small circle of pilots, engineers, and intelligence officers. The Luftwaffe certainly does not know. Their pre-war intelligence assessments of British fighter capabilities are based on publicly available specifications and captured technical documents, all of which reference 87-octane fuel, German tactical planning assumes that Bf-109 fighters will have a clear performance advantage at altitude. This assumption is about to be tested. The Battle of Britain begins officially on July 10, 1940, though the date is somewhat arbitrary. Luftwaffe attacks on British shipping and coastal targets have been ongoing for weeks, but July 10th marks the beginning of sustained, large-scale operations aimed at destroying the Royal Air Force as a prelude to invasion. The German plan is methodical and, on paper, sound. First, destroy the RAF's fighters through attrition, attack the airfields, force the British to commit their aircraft to defensive battles, and shoot them down faster than they can be replaced. Second, once air superiority is achieved, bomb Britain's ports and industrial centres into submission. Third, launch Operation Sea Lion, the amphibious invasion across the Channel. The plan assumes German numerical and technical superiority, and the numbers do favour the Luftwaffe. They have approximately 2,800 aircraft available for operations against Britain, including over 1,000 fighters. The RAF's fighter command has approximately 700 fighters operational at any given time, split between Spitfires and Hurricanes. The Germans also assume their fighters are superior. The Bf-109 has proven itself in Poland, Norway, France, and the Low Countries. It has consistently outperformed French and Polish fighters. Intelligence assessments suggest it should maintain this advantage over British aircraft. But these assessments are based on outdated data. The performance figures for British fighters in Luftwaffe intelligence files reflect pre-war specifications. They do not account for the change in fuel. The first engagements over the Channel in July are inconclusive. Both sides lose aircraft. Both sides make tactical adjustments. The RAF pilots quickly learn that the Bf-109 has advantages in certain flight regimes. It has better high-altitude performance than the Hurricane, and its fuel injection system allows it to perform negative G maneuvers without engine cutout, something the Merlin with its float carburetor cannot do. But the RAF pilots also discover something unexpected. When they push the throttle past the emergency gate, when they use the emergency boost that the new fuel makes possible, their aircraft perform in ways that surprise even them. Pilot Officer Bob Doe of No. 234 Squadron later recalls his first experience with an emergency boost in combat. It is mid-July, over a convoy off Portland. He is pursuing a Bf-109 that has altitude on him. Under normal circumstances, this would be a losing proposition. The German pilot would maintain or extend his altitude advantage, then choose whether to engage or disengage at will. But Doe pushes the throttle forward, past the wire, and the Spitfire responds with what he describes as a kick in the back. The climb rate increases dramatically. The German fighter, which moments before seemed unreachable, is suddenly within range. Doe fires, strikes, the Bf-109 trails, smoke and dive away. When Doe lands, he checks the engine. He expects to find damage, overheating, or some indication that he has abused the machinery. Instead, the engine is within normal operating parameters. The emergency boost, it turns out, is not particularly urgent at all. It is a sustainable power setting that the aircraft can maintain for extended periods without harm. This discovery spreads quickly through fighter command. Pilots begin to use emergency boost not as a last resort, but as a standard combat setting. The tactical implications are significant. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, commanding No. 242 Squadron, is among the first to recognize what the new fuel means in practical terms. Bader is an aggressive tactician who believes in engaging the enemy at every opportunity. He is also, notably, flying with 2 prosthetic legs, having lost both in a pre-war flying accident. His determination to remain operational despite this disability has become legendary within the RAF, but it also makes him acutely aware of the importance of every technical advantage. In late July, Bader drafts a tactical memo that circulates through Fighter Command. The memo is characteristically blunt. It states that British fighters now have the capability to outclimb German fighters in most situations. This advantage should be exploited by engaging the enemy at altitude rather than allowing German formations to dictate the term of combat. The memo is controversial. Conventional defensive doctrine emphasizes conserving fighters and avoiding unnecessary combat. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commanding Fighter Command, is wary of aggressive tactics that could lead to unsustainable losses. But Bader's argument is supported by the combat reports now coming in from multiple squadrons. Pilots are reporting that German fighters seem surprised by the performance of British aircraft. There are accounts of Bf-109s breaking off engagements in situations where they should have had the advantage. There are reports of German formations climbing to altitude before crossing the Channel, apparently expecting British fighters to be unable to reach them, only to find Spitfires already at their altitude or above. The Luftwaffe is beginning to realize that something has changed, though they do not yet understand what. Lieutenant Hans Ebeling, whom we encountered in the opening scene, writes in his diary on August 3, 1940, his unit, Jagdgeschwader 2-6, has been flying escort missions for bomber formations attacking British convoys and airfields. He notes, "The British fighters are more capable than we were led to believe. In particular, their climb performance exceeds the specifications in our intelligence summaries. Several of our pilots have reported being outclimbed by Spitfires at altitudes where this should not be possible. There is speculation that the British have modified their engines or are using some form of boost injection we do not know about." Ebeling's speculation is half correct. The modification is not to the engines themselves, but to what the engines are burning. But this distinction is irrelevant to the tactical reality. The Luftwaffe's pilots are discovering that their assumed technical superiority is not materializing in combat. Major Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most skilled fighter pilots and a recipient of the Knight's Cross, later writes about this period with unusual candor. In his post-war memoir, he describes the growing frustration within the fighter units as they realize the British are matching or exceeding their performance in many engagements. He attributes this partly to RAF tactics, partly to the defensive advantage of fighting over home territory, and partly to what he calls unexpected technical capabilities of British aircraft. Galland, like Ebeling, does not immediately understand the fuel factor, but he recognizes the symptoms. German fighters are having difficulty maintaining altitude advantages. They are being caught in climbing turns. They are, in some cases, being outrun in level flight at altitudes where the Bf-109 should dominate. The psychological impact of this is subtle but significant. The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots have been conditioned to believe in German technical superiority. The Bf-109 is supposed to be the best fighter in the world. When it fails to perform as advertised, or rather, when British fighters perform better than advertised, it introduces doubt. And doubt, in combat aviation, is dangerous. By mid-August, the Battle of Britain entered its most intense phase. The Luftwaffe shifts focus from attacking convoys and coastal targets to attacking RAF airfields directly. The goal is to destroy fighter command on the ground and in the air, to eliminate Britain's ability to defend itself before the onset of autumn weather makes invasion impossible. August 15th became known as Black Thursday because of the intensity of the fighting. The Luftwaffe launches coordinated raids across southern and northern England, committing nearly 1,800 aircraft in a single day. Fighter Command responds by scrambling every available squadron. The resulting air battles are chaotic and brutal. Aircraft fall from the sky over Kent, Sussex, Hampshire, and Yorkshire. Both sides suffer heavy losses, but at the end of the day, when the numbers are tallied, the RAF has destroyed 75 German aircraft while losing 34 of its own. This exchange rate is sustainable for Britain but not for Germany. The Luftwaffe has more aircraft in absolute numbers, but it is operating over enemy territory, which means that every pilot shot down over Britain is captured or killed, while RAF pilots who bail out often return to duty within days. Moreover, Britain's aircraft production is ramping up. Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Aircraft Production, has implemented an aggressive manufacturing program that is producing Spitfires and Hurricanes faster than Germany anticipated. But production numbers only matter if the aircraft can fight effectively, and their effectiveness depends, in no small part, on the fuel in their tanks. The tactical advantage provided by 100-octane fuel manifests in several ways beyond raw climb performance. Higher boost pressure means better acceleration, which translates to improved performance in turning fights, where energy management is critical. It means higher top speed at altitude, which allows RAF fighters to catch German bombers that would otherwise be too fast to intercept. It means a better rate of climb from ground level, which reduces the time RAF fighters are vulnerable during their climb to combat altitude. There is also a less quantifiable but equally important psychological dimension. RAF pilots know they are flying aircraft that can match or exceed the enemy's performance. This knowledge breeds confidence, and confidence in combat is as valuable as horsepower. Conversely, Luftwaffe pilots are beginning to lose confidence in their equipment. Not catastrophically, the Bf-109 remains a formidable fighter, but enough to introduce hesitation. When a pilot believes he has the superior aircraft, he presses attacks. When that belief erodes, he becomes cautious. The fuel advantage does not win the Battle of Britain by itself. The outcome is determined by multiple factors. Radar, which gives Fighter Command early warning of incoming raids. Effective command and control, which allows outnumbered RAF squadrons to be positioned advantageously. Superior tactics developed through painful experience. The skill and courage of individual pilots. And, crucially, the Luftwaffe's strategic errors, particularly the decision in early September to shift from attacking airfields to bombing London. But the fuel is part of the equation. It is one advantage among several, and in a battle decided by narrow margins, every advantage matters. September 7th, 1940. The Luftwaffe launches its first major raid on London. Over 300 bombers, escorted by 600 fighters, cross the Channel in the late afternoon. The target is the London docks and the East End. The intent is to draw out Fighter Command for a decisive battle of annihilation. Fighter Command responds, but not with the overwhelming force the Germans expect. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding No. 11 Group, which defends southeastern England, is careful to preserve his forces. He commits enough fighters to harass the German formations, but not so many that his squadrons become depleted. The raid causes massive damage and kills over 400 civilians, but it also represents a strategic blunder by the Luftwaffe. By shifting focus from RAF airfields to London, The Germans give Fighter Command time to repair damaged infrastructure and restore operational readiness. The bombing of London continues nightly and periodically during the day for weeks. The civilian toll is horrific, but Fighter Command remains intact. September 15th is chosen by historians as the climactic day of the Battle of Britain, though this is partly symbolic. On this day, the Luftwaffe launches what is intended to be a knockout blow: 2 massive daylight raids on London, timed to overwhelm British defences. The first raid, in the late morning, consisted of approximately 250 aircraft. Fighter Command scrambles 11 squadrons to intercept. The air battle sprawls across the skies of southern England. German bombers are harried all the way to their targets and back. RAF fighters attack repeatedly, breaking up formations, forcing bombers to jettison their loads early or miss their targets entirely. The second raid, in the early afternoon, involved another 200 aircraft. Fighter Command, despite the morning's exertions, scrambles squadrons again. More combat, more losses on both sides. By evening, the RAF claims to have destroyed 185 German aircraft. This number is an overestimate. Actual German losses are closer to 56 aircraft. Overclaiming in the chaos of combat is universal and unavoidable. But even the actual number is significant. 56 aircraft in a single day, with trained crews lost over enemy territory. The RAF loses 29 aircraft, 13 pilots were killed. But the defensive system has held. The Luftwaffe has not broken through. London has been bombed, but Fighter Command remains operational. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 2 days later, on September 17th, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The official reason is that the Luftwaffe has not achieved air superiority. The unstated reason is that air superiority now appears unachievable at acceptable cost. The Battle of Britain continues in various forms through October, but the threat of invasion has passed. Germany will not attempt to conquer Britain by force. They will try to bomb it into submission through the Blitz, but strategic bombing without an invasion threat is a war of attrition, not a war of conquest. Britain has survived. In the aftermath, the analysis begins. Both sides conduct inquiries into why the battle developed as it did. The Luftwaffe's reports cite numerous factors: the difficulty of bomber escort operations at extreme range, the effectiveness of British radar, tactical errors in targeting priorities, underestimation of RAF fighter strength. Buried in the technical assessments is a note about British fighter performance. Luftwaffe intelligence finally revises its estimates of Spitfire and Hurricane capabilities upward. The revised specifications note improved climb rates and higher combat ceilings. The cause is listed as probable engine modifications or improved boost systems. It takes several more months before German intelligence correctly identifies the fuel factor. By that time, it is too late to change the outcome of the battle. The Luftwaffe shifts its focus eastward, preparing for the invasion of the Soviet Union. Britain, though battered, remains unconquered and will eventually become the base for the Allied liberation of Europe. Rod Banks continues his work throughout the war. His role expands beyond fuel chemistry. He became involved in engine development, working with Rolls-Royce to optimize the Merlin for different operational requirements. He contributed to the development of even higher octane fuels, eventually reaching 150 octane for late war applications, and to the use of water methanol injection for emergency power boosts. His work receives official recognition, but not celebrity. In 1942, he was awarded the Order of the British Empire for services to aviation fuel development. The citation is brief and technical. It does not mention that his early, unauthorized experiments potentially changed the outcome of Britain's most desperate hour. After the war, Banks wrote relatively little about his experiences. He returns to Shell, continues research, and eventually retires. In interviews conducted years later, he is characteristically modest. When asked about his decision to circumvent normal procedures and develop high-octane fuel without authorization, he offers a simple explanation. "I did not think very much about whether I had permission. I thought about the pilots. They were going to fight whether the fuel was adequate or not. My job was to make sure it was adequate." This understated response conceals a more complex reality. What Banks did was, in the strictest sense, insubordinate. He violated company policy. He ignored patent restrictions. He risked his career on the conviction that he was correct and that the established system was wrong. He was correct, and his willingness to act on that conviction, before official authorization caught up with necessity, is part of why Britain survived 1940. There is a broader lesson in this story, one that extends beyond the technical details of octane ratings and engine performance. Wars are often decided not by grand strategies or decisive battles alone, but by the accumulation of small advantages. A few 100 feet per minute of climb rate, a few miles per hour of top speed, a few degrees of turn radius. Individually, these advantages seem marginal. Collectively, they determine who lives and who dies, who wins and who loses. The advantage provided by 100-octane fuel was not overwhelming. It did not make British fighters invincible. RAF pilots still faced a numerically superior enemy flying-capable aircraft. They still died in significant numbers. The Battle of Britain was desperately close, decided by narrow margins in dozens of individual engagements. But margins matter, and the fuel was one of those margins. It is also worth noting what did not happen. The International Petroleum Cartel did not voluntarily provide high-octane fuel to Britain. The market did not spontaneously produce the optimal solution. The existing system of patents and agreements and profit calculations would have left the RAF flying on 87-octane fuel indefinitely, or at least until the crisis forced a response that would have come too late. What changed the outcome was individual initiative, Banks's willingness to work outside the system, and government willingness to override normal procedures when national survival was at stake. The Air Ministry's decision in March of 1939 to invoke emergency powers and mandate high-octane fuel production was, in a sense, the government catching up to what Banks had already proven was necessary. This pattern repeats throughout World War II. Individual engineers, scientists, and officers identify critical problems and solve them through informal channels, bypassing bureaucracy because formal channels are too slow. The development of radar, the breaking of Enigma codes, the design of the jet engine, each of these involved people working at or beyond the edges of their authority because they understood the stakes. Banks was one of these people. His contribution was less visible than radar or code breaking, but it was no less important. The story also highlights the difference between technical possibility and operational reality. High-octane fuel was technically possible in the 1930s. The chemistry was understood. The manufacturing processes existed. But technical possibility does not automatically translate into implementation. Implementation requires investment, organization, political will, and often a crisis to overcome institutional inertia. In this case, the crisis was the impending war. But even with the crisis, implementation required someone to push someone willing to risk professional consequences to force the issue. Banks was that person. There is an interesting counterfactual to consider. What if Banks had not conducted his unauthorized experiments? What if he had accepted his company's initial refusal and returned to standard work? What if the Air Ministry had not acted in March of 1939, but had waited for formal procedures to run their course? The timeline suggests that without Banks's early work, 100-octane fuel would not have been in widespread RAF use by July of 1940. Development and production would have been delayed by months or possibly years. The RAF would have fought the Battle of Britain on 87-octane fuel. Would Britain have lost? Not necessarily. The other factors, radar, tactics, pilot skill, German strategic errors would still have mattered, but the margin of survival would have been narrower. More RAF pilots would have died. More aircraft would have been lost. The attrition balance would have favoured Germany more strongly. It is possible that fighter command would have been worn down to the point where the Luftwaffe achieved temporary air superiority. It is possible that Operation Sea Lion would have proceeded. These outcomes are not certain, but they become more probable without the fuel advantage. History turns on such contingencies. A single chemist's decision to ignore the rules, a government's willingness to override peacetime constraints. The United States quietly supplied a critical chemical to a nation officially at peace. Each of these small decisions, individually insignificant, collectively decisive, by 1942, even Germany had switched to 100-octane fuel for its fighter aircraft. The patent issues have become irrelevant. The international agreements are meaningless in total war. Every nation with the industrial capacity to produce high-octane fuel does so, because the alternative is to concede air superiority to whoever does. The technological advantage that Britain gained in 1940 is eroded by 1942, but those 2 years matter. They are the years when Britain stands alone, when survival is uncertain, when every advantage is magnified by desperation. Rod Banks's fuel provides one of those advantages, not the only one, not the decisive one, but one of several that, combined, make the difference between national survival and national extinction. In the larger narrative of World War II, this episode is a footnote. The Battle of Britain is remembered for the courage of the few, for Churchill's oratory, for the resilience of London under the Blitz. The fuel is technical detail, not dramatic narrative. But technical details matter. They matter to the pilot in the cockpit who needs every foot of altitude he can gain. They matter to the nation that survives because its fighters are slightly faster, slightly more capable, slightly better equipped than the enemy anticipated. They matter because wars are won or lost, not just by bravery and strategy, but by logistics, chemistry, engineering, by the unglamorous work of making sure that when the crucial moment comes, the tools work as well as they possibly can. Rod Banks understood this. He spent his career making tools work better, and in 1940, when Britain's survival depended on whether its fighter aircraft could match German performance, the tool he had built, the fuel he had synthesized in defiance of convention and authority, did exactly what it needed to do. It burned. It powered Merlin engines at higher boost pressures than they were originally designed for. It gave RAF pilots a fighting chance. And in a battle decided by narrow margins, a fighting chance was enough. There is a photograph, held in the Imperial War Museum's collection, taken sometime in late 1940. It shows a group of RAF pilots from No. 609 Squadron at Warmwell Airfield in Dorset. They are standing in front of a Spitfire, still in their flight gear, May vests inflated, parachute harnesses visible. Several are smoking cigarettes. One is laughing at something someone has just said. Another stares directly at the camera with the 1,000-yard stare that becomes common among combat pilots. What the photograph cannot show is what keeps these men alive long enough to pose for it. It cannot show the fuel in the Spitfire's tanks behind them. It cannot show the octane rating or the tetraethyl lead content or the careful blending of hydrocarbons that allows the Merlin engine to produce 400 additional horsepower when needed most. But that fuel is there, invisible and essential, the chemical foundation of their survival. This invisibility is characteristic of many critical contributions to the war effort. The public narrative focuses on visible heroism, pilots in combat, soldiers in battle, ships at sea. The invisible infrastructure that makes heroism possible receives less attention. Fuel is infrastructure. So is logistics, intelligence, industrial production, scientific research. None of these categories generate the dramatic imagery that shapes popular memory, but all are indispensable. Rod Banks's contribution belongs to this category of invisible but essential work. His name does not appear in most histories of the Battle of Britain. When the battle is commemorated, the focus is rightly on the aircrew who fought it. But the commemoration is incomplete without acknowledging the support systems that made their success possible. The fuel was one such system. After the immediate crisis of the Battle of Britain passes, the demand for high-octane fuel continues to grow. As the war expands and intensifies, aviation fuel becomes a critical strategic resource, subject to the same calculations of supply, demand, and allocation as steel or ammunition. Britain's production capacity increases throughout the war. Additional refineries are brought online or retrofitted. The supply of tetraethyl lead from the United States becomes more reliable as American neutrality gives way to Lend-Lease and eventually to full alliance. By 1943, Britain is producing not only 100-octane fuel, but experimental batches of 130 and 150-octane fuels for specialized applications. These higher grades become necessary as engine technology advances. The Merlin engine continues to evolve. New variants with two-stage superchargers require fuel that can withstand even higher boost pressures. By 1944, late-model Spitfires and Mustangs are routinely operating at power levels that would have destroyed their engines if fueled with 1940-era specifications. Rod Banks remains involved in this development work. His expertise is in demand. He works with Rolls-Royce on engine modifications. He consults with the Ministry of Aircraft Production on fuel supply logistics. He contributes to research on alternative additives and synthetic fuel components. But his most important contribution remains the initial one, recognizing the problem early, developing a solution before it was officially requested, and pushing that solution into operational use over institutional resistance. This pattern, early recognition, unofficial development, persistent advocacy, becomes something of a model for how technical innovation happens under wartime pressure. The formal procurement system is too slow. The normal channels are too, encumbered by peacetime assumptions and procedures. Progress requires individuals willing to work around the system, and it requires superiors willing to tolerate or even encourage such behavior when the results prove valuable. The British war effort, particularly in scientific and technical domains, succeeds partly because it creates space for this kind of initiative. The culture is not purely hierarchical. There is room for argument, for bypassing channels when necessary, for proving concepts through demonstration rather than through committees. Banks benefits from this culture, but he also helps create it by example. His success with high-octane fuel demonstrates that unauthorized initiative can produce critical results. This demonstration influences how other technical problems are approached throughout the war. The strategic importance of aviation fuel extends beyond Britain. As the United States enters the war and begins building its massive air forces, fuel becomes a central concern. American aircraft, B-17 and B-24 bombers, P-38 and P-47 and P-51 fighters are designed from the outset to use 100-octane fuel. American production capacity for both fuel and tetraethyl lead dwarfs Britain's. By 1943, the United States is producing more than 90 million barrels of 100-octane aviation fuel per year. This fuel powers the strategic bombing campaign against Germany, the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific, and eventually the long-range fighter escorts that make daylight bombing viable over Europe. The availability of high-octane fuel influences aircraft design in fundamental ways. Engines can be designed for higher power output because the fuel can support it. This enables larger, heavier aircraft with greater range and payload. The B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber of the war, depends entirely on high-octane fuel for its Wright R3350 engines to function as designed. In the Pacific theater, the advantage is even more pronounced. Japanese aviation fuel production suffers from limited access to crude oil and critical additives. Japanese fighters and bombers typically operate on 87 to 92 octane fuel. American aircraft operating on 100 or 130 octane fuel have a significant performance advantage, particularly at high altitude, where the difference in boost pressure becomes most apparent. This fuel disparity contributes to the growing dominance of American air power in the Pacific from 1943 onward. Japanese pilots find themselves outclimbed, outrun, and outfought by American aircraft that are often heavier and less aerodynamically refined, but benefit from superior engine performance enabled by superior fuel. The lesson is clear. In modern mechanized warfare, chemistry matters as much as courage. Industrial capacity matters as much as tactical skill. The side that can produce better fuel in greater quantity gains, an advantage that accumulates across thousands of individual engagements. Germany, despite its advanced chemical industry, struggles with aviation fuel production throughout the war. The reasons are multiple. Allied bombing targets, synthetic fuel plants, access to crude oil is limited. The additives required for high-octane fuel become increasingly scarce as the war progresses, and supply lines are disrupted. By 1944, the Luftwaffe faced chronic fuel shortages, not just shortages of quantity, though those are severe, but shortages of quality. Fuel that would have been acceptable in 1940 is inadequate for late-war engines operating at extreme performance levels. German jet aircraft, when they appear, require even more specialized fuels that are difficult to produce in sufficient quantities. The result is a progressive degradation of Luftwaffe capability that is less visible than the loss of aircraft or pilots, but equally crippling. Squadrons cannot train adequately because fuel is rationed. When they do fly, their aircraft perform below optimal levels because the fuel quality is inconsistent. Engines fail or require more frequent maintenance. Range is reduced. Combat effectiveness declines. By the time Allied forces invaded Normandy in June of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The reasons are multiple losses in pilots and aircraft, Allied air superiority, strategic bombing but fuel shortage is among them. The vaunted German war machine is quite literally running dry. Britain, meanwhile, has more than enough fuel. Production has scaled to meet demand. The supply lines from America are secure. RAF and American Air Forces operating from British bases have virtually unlimited access to high-quality aviation fuel. This abundance enables the intensive training programs, the round-the-clock bombing campaigns, and eventually the air superiority over the invasion beaches that makes D-Day possible. The contrast is stark. One side has refined the chemistry and scaled the production, the other side has not. And in a war where air power is increasingly decisive, this difference matters enormously. Rod Banks does not participate directly in the D-Day invasion or the subsequent campaigns. His role is in the laboratories and refineries, not the cockpits. But his work is present in every aircraft that flies over Normandy on June 6, 1944. It is present in the fuel tanks of every Spitfire providing air cover, every Typhoon attacking German positions, every American Thunderbolt escorting bombers to their targets. The invasion succeeds for many reasons, but one of those reasons is that Allied aircraft dominate the skies, and that dominance is built, in part, on the fuel Banks helped develop 4 years earlier. By late 1944, Banks was already thinking beyond the immediate war. He is involved in research on gas turbine engines, what will eventually be called jet engines, and on the specialized fuels these engines will require. He recognizes that piston engines, no matter how refined, are approaching their practical limits. The future of aviation lies in jets, and jets will need different chemistry. This forward thinking is characteristic of Banks's approach. He is not content to solve the immediate problem. He is always looking ahead to the next challenge, the next technical barrier that will need to be overcome. When the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, Banks was 57 years old. He has spent nearly a decade working on wartime fuel problems. The end of hostilities does not mean the end of his work. There is still the Pacific War, which continues until August. There is the transition to peacetime production. There is the question of what to do with the massive infrastructure built for wartime fuel production. And there is, though few recognize it yet, the beginning of the Cold War and the Jet Age, both of which will create new demands for fuel chemistry expertise. Banks receives his OBE in the 1946 New Year Honours. The citation is brief and technical, noting his contributions to aviation fuel development during the war. There is no public ceremony, no newspaper coverage. The recognition is official but low-key. This suits Banks. He is not seeking celebrity. He returns to Shell and continues working on peacetime fuel research. He publishes technical papers. He consults on engine development projects. He becomes a Fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society and contributes to various technical committees. But he does not write extensively about his wartime experiences. In the 1950s and 60s, as historians begin documenting the Battle of Britain in detail, Banks is occasionally interviewed or consulted. He provides information when asked, but does not seek attention. His attitude seems to be that he did his job. The job was important, and that is sufficient. This modesty is both admirable and historically unfortunate. Many technical contributors to the war effort remain obscure because they do not advocate for their own recognition. The public history of the war focuses on military operations and political decisions. The technical infrastructure that made those operations possible receives less scrutiny. As a result, most people who know about the Battle of Britain can name the aircraft Spitfire, Hurricane, Messerschmitt, and perhaps some of the pilots. Very few can name the chemist who made sure those aircraft had the fuel to fight effectively. This is not necessarily wrong. Wars are fought by people in combat, and their courage deserves primary recognition. but the full story includes the support systems. And those systems are built by people like Banks who work in laboratories rather than cockpits, but whose contributions are no less essential. In 1978, at age 70, Banks published a memoir titled I Kept No Diary. The title is ironic because the book is based on extensive notes and recollections. It covers his entire career, including the wartime fuel work, but the tone is characteristically understated. Banks describes technical problems and solutions. He mentions the urgency of wartime work and the satisfaction of seeing his research applied operationally. But he does not dramatize or claim excessive credit. The memoir receives modest attention. It is reviewed in technical journals and read by aviation historians, but does not become widely known. This is partly because it is published by a specialized press, and partly because Banks writes in the measured style of a research chemist, rather than the dramatic style of popular history. But the memoir is valuable precisely because of this style. It provides an insider's account of how technical innovation actually happens, the false starts, the institutional resistance, the importance of persistence, the role of individual initiative, the need to sometimes circumvent normal procedures. These details are absent from most popular histories, which tend to present innovation as a smooth process of problem identification followed by solution implementation. The reality, as Banks describes it, is messier. Innovation requires not just technical skill but also political skill, the ability to navigate bureaucracies, the willingness to take risks, and often a degree of insubordination. The best solutions do not always emerge from official channels. Sometimes they emerge despite official channels. This is a useful lesson, applicable beyond the specific context of wartime fuel development. But it is a lesson that receives little attention because the people who could teach it, the Banks of the world, tend to be modest, focused on work rather than publicity, and disinclined to claim credit at the expense of others. Rod Banks died in 1985, at age 77. His obituaries appear in technical journals and aviation publications. They note his contributions to fuel chemistry and engine development. They mention the OBE. They summarize his career at Shell and his wartime work, but the obituaries do not capture the full significance of what he accomplished. They cannot, because that significance is diffuse, spread across thousands of individual flights and combat engagements, embedded in the survival of pilots who never knew his name. How do you measure the impact of fuel? Not in octane ratings or boost pressures, though those are the technical metrics. The real measure is in outcomes, in pilots who came home, in battles won. In a nation that survived because its fighters were slightly better equipped than the enemy anticipated. Banks's fuel did not win the Battle of Britain alone, but it was part of the complex equation that determined the outcome, and in a battle decided by narrow margins, every part of that equation matters. There is a broader pattern here worth examining. World War II is often remembered as a conflict between good and evil, freedom and tyranny, democracy and fascism. These moral frameworks are not wrong, but they are incomplete. The war was also a contest of industrial capacity, technological innovation, and logistical competence. Germany began the war with significant advantages in military technology and tactical doctrine. Their tanks were better. Their aircraft were competitive or superior. Their army had modern operational concepts that other nations lacked. These advantages enabled rapid conquests in 1939 and 1940, but Germany could not sustain these advantages. Allied industrial production eventually overwhelmed German capacity. Allied innovation eventually matched or exceeded German technology. And critically, The Allies succeeded in solving logistical problems, how to move fuel, ammunition, food, and supplies across oceans and continents that Germany never fully mastered. The fuel story is a microcosm of this larger pattern. Germany started with better fuel in 1936. Britain caught up by 1940. By 1944, the Allies had far surpassed Germany in both quality and quantity of aviation fuel production. This reversal did not happen automatically. It required individuals like banks to identify the problem, develop solutions, and push those solutions into implementation. It required governments to invest in industrial capacity. It required international cooperation, particularly between Britain and the United States. It required a system that could recognize technical merit and act on it quickly despite peacetime procedures and institutional inertia. The democracies proved better at this than the dictatorships, not because democratic systems are inherently more innovative, they often are not, but because democratic systems tend to be more tolerant of argument, disagreement, and initiative from below. Banks could advocate for his fuel because the British system allowed for such advocacy. A chemist in Nazi Germany who contradicted official policy would likely have faced harsher consequences. This is a subtle advantage, but advantages accumulate. Over the course of a long war, the side that can better harness individual initiative and technical expertise tends to prevail, assuming rough parity in other factors. Today, more than 80 years after the Battle of Britain, the Spitfires and Hurricanes that survive are museum pieces or carefully maintained flying exhibits. When they fly at air shows, they burn modern aviation fuel, not the exact formulation banks developed. Engine technology has moved on. Fuel chemistry has advanced. The specific problems banks solved are no longer relevant to current aviation. But the principles remain relevant. Technical capability matters. Chemistry matters. The unglamorous work of infrastructure and logistics matters. Wars are not won solely by courage and strategy, but by the accumulation of technical advantages, many of them invisible to the public eye. Banks understood this. He spent his career working on one such advantage fuel, and he worked on it with a sense of urgency and purpose that overrode normal career considerations. When the rules got in the way of what needed to be done, he bypassed the rules. When authorization was slow, he moved ahead without it. When his company said no, he found other ways to proceed. This kind of determination, focused on a technical problem rather than personal glory, is rare and valuable. It is also, by its nature, under-recognized. Banks did not lead armies or make political decisions. He synthesized fuel. But the fuel mattered. There is a final irony worth noting. The international petroleum cartel that initially resisted high-octane fuel production, the patent agreements and profit calculations that banks defied, collapsed during the war. Total war makes peacetime business arrangements irrelevant. By 1945, every nation with industrial capacity was producing the best fuel it could, regardless of patents or pre-war agreements. The market did not produce this outcome. Government intervention and individual initiative produced it. The optimal technical solution became standard not because it was profitable, but because it was necessary for survival. After the war, high-octane aviation fuel became the global standard. The resistance banks encountered in the late 1930s seems, in retrospect, absurd. Of course you use the best fuel available. Of course you optimize for performance rather than cost when lives are at stake. The logic is obvious. But it was not obvious in 1936. It required someone to make it obvious, to demonstrate it, to push it through institutional resistance. Banks was that person. And because he was that person, because he synthesized that fuel and pushed for its adoption, RAF pilots in 1940 flew with a technical advantage they did not know they had. They pushed throttles past emergency gates and felt engines surge with power that exceeded specifications. They outclimbed German fighters that should have had altitude advantage. They survived engagements they might otherwise have lost. Not all of them. The Battle of Britain killed 544 RAF aircrew. No fuel, however advanced, could save everyone. But some survived who would not have. Some shot down German aircraft that would otherwise have escaped. Some returned to fly another day, accumulating experience that made them more effective. The margins were narrow. Britain's survival was not inevitable. It required everything to go right, or at least right enough. The fuel was one thing that went right. And it went right because one chemist decided that rules mattered less than results, that process mattered less than outcomes, and that when national survival is at stake, you do what needs to be done regardless of authorization. Rod Banks did what needed to be done. He mixed fuel, and the fuel, invisible and essential, helped tilt the sky. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.